Hello there, I'm Natalie Haynes, and I am here to talk to you about goddesses and Amazons and women of the Trojan War. This is in advance of They Have Waited Long Enough, which is tomorrow afternoon. And that is three pieces of music. You may know this already, in which case, obviously, don't listen for the next minute or so, and that will be completely fine. I won't even judge you. But if not, here's some information for you. Tomorrow, for They Have Waited Long Enough, there'll be three pieces of music inspired by Medea, who is one of the most notorious bad mothers, let's say, in all of Greek tragedy, indeed in all of Greek myth. Circe, who is the sorceress who Odysseus dallies with, shall we say, tactfully for a year on his odyssey back to his, what am I calling her? Wife, Penelope. Let's all remind ourselves, I always feel like we have to, that we always think of Odysseus's journey home as being the great adventure story, because it takes him 10 years. Fully 8 of those years are spent in the houses of 2 women. That's all I'm saying. Just the 2 years spent having actual adventures. The other 8 years, so let me just check, 4 times as much time spent having purely horizontal adventures. I'm just saying. And also Penelope, who is the wife waiting for Odysseus at home, tapping her watch somewhat before watches are invented, obviously, because it's Bronze Age Greece. And those pieces of music, those 3 pieces of music, have been composed by brilliant women composers and are being performed tomorrow for your delectation. And I'll be doing a little introduction to each of those characters. So the idea of today was for those of you who maybe are interested in Greek myth but don't know so much around Greek myth, that I would give you a bit of context so that tomorrow's concert would seem even more awesome than it already does, which is, let's remind ourselves, almost entirely awesome. The only thing that's not awesome about it is that it's not yet tomorrow, so you can't have it yet. That's it. That's the only thing that's missing. That's all I'm saying. So, I thought we would follow exactly the description that was the title of this lecture, which is that I will talk to you about a goddess and some Amazons and some women of the Trojan War. It seems only fair. I don't want everyone to get sued for trade descriptions. So I thought we would start out with a goddess, or actually someone who is created by gods and goddesses, and that is Pandora, for the excellent reason that she is the first woman. Before, I mean, if we're going to start anywhere, we really have to start with the first woman, because otherwise there can be none. There's just slightly fewer than there are in the film Highlander. I don't know why I'm obsessed with the film Highlander. I should well know by now that, frankly, it's just not a relevant reference point to most people. And yet, apparently, I still know the entire film by heart and can't stop thinking about it. I don't know why that is. I do know why that is. It's too late now. So, Pandora is the first woman, and she has been on the receiving end of some of the worst press of any character in any myth cycle anywhere in the world. This is a recurring theme with women, by the way, in these stories. And Pandora, I always feel extremely strongly about, because she has been cruelly misrepresented, I would say, sometimes by accident and sometimes deliberately. So for us now, I think the most famous thing about Pandora probably is that she has a box, right? A box which she opens, and it's full of all the terrible things in the world, and all of them come out into the world, and therefore the world is full of terrible things. And you know whose fault it is? Pandora's, that woman over there who couldn't leave well alone. And that is the story that we all know. So it may come as a surprise to you to know that Pandora doesn't have a box ever in the ancient world. She doesn't get a box until she is mistranslated by Erasmus, a Dutchman of all the people you think you can rely on. A perfectly reliable Dutch polymath is suddenly the person who is responsible for giving Pandora a box. Before that, she either has nothing, we'll talk about it in a second, or a jar, right? And in one version of her story, in Hesiod, who is a Greek poet who is almost as old, or perhaps even older than Homer, so one of our very earliest poets in ancient Greek, Hesiod tells 2 versions of her story. In the first version, or we assume it is the first because it's shorter, in a poem called the Theogony, The Origin of the Gods, we get the story of Pandora. So she belongs amongst goddesses. She's told, we get her story in the Theogony, the god born, as it technically means, I guess. And in that version of the story, we're told that Zeus wants to punish mortals, which of course means mortal men, because women don't exist yet. And he wants to punish mortals because Prometheus, who is a titan, has done two things which have annoyed Zeus, and Zeus is famously irritable on his best day, which it almost literally never is. The first thing is that Prometheus has tricked Zeus into choosing the bad bit of an animal for a sacrifice. So when you sacrifice animals in ancient Greece, you divide up this is really hard for me because I'm vegetarian, and I've been vegetarian for more than 30 years. So honestly, I don't really know what bits of an animal are. To me, they're all just not really food, a bit like furniture or something like that. So when I do this story, I have to imagine different categories of lentil or something like that in order to make it meaningful for me, just so you know. Were you expecting a proper lecture? I promise I do know quite a lot of Greek. It's just also what you'll get is this is the problem with doing events remotely, is that you get my constant inner monologue, which, as you can see, is a sort of fun heckling device, but doesn't actually get us to the point ever quicker. If anything, the opposite. But there we are. It is what it is. So in Greek animal sacrifice, remember how we were there a minute ago? The gods' portion, which obviously mortals have to offer to them, is bones and offal, which sound thoroughly unappealing, although obviously so does the rest of an animal if you're me, right? Lentils, that's all I'm saying. And mortals get the nice bits, whatever the nice bits are. What are the nice bit, is it muscle? I mean, it sounds kind of gross either way, but anyway, this is not my problem, I realize. And it's Prometheus who makes it this way around. He separates the offerings into two categories, and he says to Zeus, you choose, and he puts a glistening piece of fat, which honestly sounds repulsive, but apparently looks delicious, on top of the bones and the offal. And then he makes the meat bit look differently vile, I suppose. And Zeus, falling for this trick, goes, oh, I'll take the glistening fat, please, and then finds that a switcheroo has basically occurred, and he has now got the grisly bit. Oh, grisly bit. That's an unexpected pun, is what nobody knew that was coming, least of all me. But there you go, every now and then. And Zeus is vexed by this, because obviously it now means forever that the gods will always get the rubbish bit. I mean, you'd think, given that they're gods, they could just go, we demand the other bit, but they don't anyway. Yeah, fair enough, he lost fair and square. Well, unfair and not square, but anyway, that's how it happens. And then the second thing Prometheus does, which irritates Zeus, is to steal fire, which has previously been in the divine realm, and not amongst mortals. Right? And Prometheus steals fire and gives it to mortal men, and his punishment for that, famously, is to be tied to a rock, and for all eternity he gets his liver pecked out by some sort of bird, usually an eagle, perhaps a vulture, and that happens every day because he is a titan. It grows back. And see, this isn't grosser to me than the animal sacrifice. Not going to lie. This is all the same as far as I'm concerned. I've probably just made him a liver out of lentils as well, just in case you were wondering. Or perhaps this time I've gone for chickpeas as a variety. Zeus is already peeved with mortals for having gained fire and also the nice bit of sacrifices. And so he insists on a twofold revenge, a payback, essentially. The Greek is antagathoio, something in exchange for the good things. And that thing in exchange for the good things is Pandora. And Hesiod calls her kalon kakon. She is a good bad. Kalos meaning good, kakos meaning bad. I should tell you that this phrase is almost always, this just gives you the beginnings of an idea of what happens to Pandora when she's translated. That phrase is almost always translated as beautiful evil. So the positive quality becomes visual and the negative quality becomes moral. So instead of thinking, oh, she's a good bad, like you might say jolie laide in French, right? Beautiful ugly. That's fine. That would be a perfectly acceptable translation of kalon kakon, but we never do. You almost always see it as beautiful evil. She's pretty, but she's bad. And, that right there tells you everything you need to know, really, about how Pandora has been shaped through time. But obviously, I'm still going to tell you more because I've decided that, while that might be everything you know or need to know, it's not enough for me. So there it is. And so Zeus sends a message to Hephaestus, who is the blacksmith god. He sculpts Pandora not out of bronze, but out of clay, out of the earth, which is why if you see visual images of Pandora, it often looks like she's having quite a difficult day because in order to sculpt Pandora from the earth, you have to release the clay from the earth, which you do with hammers. So it always looks like she's being assaulted by an array of people armed with hammers, but in fact they are freeing her from the earth. It's nice, as far as a woman who's basically made out of clay being attacked by people with hammers goes. It's one of the nicest versions of that story you'll ever see, is what I'm saying. So Pandora gets freed from the earth, and then she is also created. There are additional elements of her creation by Athene, who helps with her weaving skills, for example, and gives her a beautiful dress. Hermes gives her a dog-like mind. Dogs not as loved by the ancients as they are now, I'm afraid. So it means cunning or conniving rather than something positive. We might say dog-like meaning loyal, I think, but the Greeks do not. When Helen refers to herself as dog-like in book 3, I'm going to say, of Homer's Iliad, I think it's 3. It could be 6. It's definitely 3 or 6. That's what I'm saying. She doesn't mean, oh, I'm so loyal and delightful, because obviously the very definition of Helen is that she hasn't been very loyal. She means that, you know, she's done the wrong thing. She's using it as a self-reproach. And so these various characteristics are then given to Pandora, and she is sent to Earth, to mortal men, in order to cause chaos, essentially. She's an agent of change, as Zeus wants. There is no mention at any point in this story of her having any kind of receptacle at all. In the second version that Hesiod gives us, in the Works and Days, which is a really difficult poem to describe the genre of, because it's basically it's a poem about agriculture, and also has stories about gods and goddesses in, and also it's a really good opportunity for Hesiod. Hesiod hates 2 people, his brother and women. And this is really a good opportunity for him to say that his brother has not, prepared enough, hasn't done enough harvesting and put things in a barn. So he's basically, I wish I were joking. Honestly, Sarah, I'm very happy to see you laugh, but this is exactly, well, in case you're all wondering, I can just see Sarah giggling, and it's the nicest thing. I haven't had an audience for ages. It's just making me show off even more. And now James has gone as well. I can't tell you how pleasing it is for me. I'm just showing off for 2 people, and the rest of you are it's like a drive-by as far as you're concerned. You're just tragic bystanders in this tremendous quantity of showing off. So, what was I talking? No one remembers. It's all too late. So, Hesiod, and his brother is called Perses, and he hates him. But he also hates women. He's obviously been done wrong, and I assume that his wife left him for his brother. That would explain all of Hesiod's problems, because basically at any given moment, he will suddenly go off onto a tangent to say, the thing that's wrong with women is they're not enough like bees. And you go, well, yes, that's objectively true. I am almost nothing like a bee. Fair point, Hesiod. That's got to stand. You're not quite so much like a bee yourself, sir. Now we're on the subject, but I'm just saying, let's all just front it out. We're not like bees. Anyway, he's vexed with women for not being like bees. He's vexed with his brother. And the story of Prometheus and Pandora, and Prometheus's not so bright younger brother Epimetheus, it ticks so many of Hesiod's boxes, he can't believe his luck. It's like, here's a story where he gets to slag off brothers and women. Get in. So Hesiod tells the story again in the Works and Days. And in this version of the story, there's a bit more detail, and Pandora's dress and how it's decorated and how pretty it is and all of those things, her voice given to her by Hermes and all of that stuff. But we're also told that Prometheus has said to his brother, the word Prometheus, by the way, means foresight. The word Epimetheus, his brother's name, means hindsight, right? So we know from the get-go, a very nice old-fashioned technique of telling us what kind of person someone is by the kind of name that they have. So Prometheus says to his brother, don't accept any gifts from Zeus, because I have obviously done the whole stealing of fire thing. So anything he sends is definitely going to be a bad idea. And Epimetheus goes, right, I definitely won't accept any gifts from Zeus. And then 20 minutes later, Hermes turns up with Pandora and says, I bring you a wife. And Epimetheus goes, come on in. What could possibly go wrong? You're like, dude, seriously? And in this version of the story, Pandora has a jar. We're never told where it comes from. We get a whole chunk of text about her dress and her, the decorations on it and all of those things. We're never told where the jar comes from. I think we have to assume that Hermes has given her the jar, because he's escorted her from Mount Olympus, where the gods live and where she was created, to, the rest of the world, to where Epimetheus lives. So we have to assume, I think, that Hermes has given her the jar or brought the jar. And then the jar is opened, and all these terrible things that are inside the jar get out into the world. And that's the version of the story that we know. Except here's the thing. In some versions of the story, for example, the version told by Theognis in his Elegies, the jar is full of good things. It's full of nice things. And those are what are released into the world. Now, you can see either way. You can see those things as positive or negative, right? If the jar has bad things in it, are they safe in the jar? And then when she opens it, they're all let out. If it has good things in it, are they trapped in the jar? And then when she opens it, they all get out. Or is that the problem? In either version of the story, the one thing left hiding under the rim, usually, of the jar is elpis, which is almost always translated as hope. But in Greek, it doesn't have the same sense of being something necessarily positive. So it more literally means expectation. The expectation of something happening, bad or good, is it's not a very elegant translation, but it's more accurate. And so, again, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is Pandora saving hope for us, keeping it safe in the jar? Or is she withholding hope from us? All these terrible things have been loosed into the world, but we don't even have hope because Pandora is keeping it. I should also tell you that one of the most famous sets of accounts to come to us at all about the Greeks is probably Aesop's fables, right? We don't necessarily think about them being Greek texts because they're usually, stories that we read as children about talking animals. But they are, of course, texts written in Greek. And in one of Aesop's versions of the Pandora story, the jar is opened by Epimetheus. It's not opened by Pandora at all. But what happens, of course, is that the Pandora story gets overlaid onto the Eve narrative. And the idea of a beautiful woman whose fault everything is just too tempting for a patriarchal system to resist. And it doesn't resist it. And yet still, although Pandora is often presented in this negative light once Christianity exists, which is, after all, many hundreds of years after Pandora's story is first told, if we look at visual representations of her from the ancient world, she is never, ever shown holding a jar. She's never shown with any receptacle. She's always shown in the act of being created. For the ancients, what's important about Pandora is that she's the first woman. She's our ancestor. For the ancients, men are descended from a chthonic, an earthborn man named Erichthonius, and women are descended from Pandora. We are literally different races, men and women, according to the Greeks in this version of their origin story. And that's what's crucial about Pandora. So, for example, the story of Pandora was shown at eye height in the Parthenon in Athens. So she's she's not a villain to the Greeks. To the Greeks, she is simply the beginning of women, although obviously for Hesiod, those two things are the same. But generally, they are not the same. And yet her story is changed. And then it becomes irrevocably changed, I think, when Erasmus takes on Hesiod. And Erasmus, obviously a hugely learned man, mistranslates the Greek word pithos for the Latin word pixis. That's a really easy mistake, right? Jar for box. Now, there are some scholars who thought perhaps he had mixed Pandora up with another character from Greek myth, Psyche, from the story of Cupid and Psyche, or Eros and Psyche. Psyche does have a box. Pandora doesn't have a box. I think it's more likely that he just made a linguistic mistake. The words are so close, pithos, pixis. And at that point, therefore, Pandora goes from having a jar, sometimes, to having a box, always. And in almost every single painting of Pandora or sculpture of Pandora within about 20 or 30 years of Erasmus translating it this way, she's shown with a box. The box gets smaller and becomes more ornate, or it gets bigger and it's like a strong box and she's making a real effort to open it. And so really Erasmus is kind of responsible, at least partly responsible, for the rubbishing of Pandora's name, her good name. And he has form. I've got to tell you, this isn't the only time he does it. So in English, and I realize this, I don't know if this is true also in Flemish or in Dutch, but in English, there is a phrase, if somebody is very blunt, if they say things very plainly and bluntly, the phrase in English is that person likes to call a spade a spade. And that comes from Erasmus mistranslating the Greek. Because in Greek, the word scaphe means something hollowed out, like a canoe. So when he says it, that's the word he's mistranslating and to be spayed. So what we should say is that somebody who's really forthright likes to call a canoe, and yet we do not, but we should, is what I'm saying. So these things aren't always gendered issues. Sometimes it's canoes that have missed out, and I just can't tell you how very strongly I feel about that, but I'm very happy to get a placard and march in favour of the overlooked canoe in this time. So I'm going to have some Diet Coke. Sorry, Sarah, I can't cope with that. Caffeine is the only thing that's keeping me going, I'm afraid. And I don't drink hot drinks. No, I know. I don't drink tea, even though I live in England. It's a mystery, isn't it? Sooner or later, they'll take my passport off me. And that will be richly deserved, I would imagine. I've only had to slag off the government quite a lot, but it'll be the tea drinking, brackets, not, that really eventually pushes them over the edge. So, oh man, we've had 20 minutes just on Pandora. Right, Amazons, or we're going to run out of time. Stop distracting me, everyone, with your not even being here nature. So, Amazons. I think we'll do the story of Penthesilea, because she is my favourite of the Amazons. But the important thing to bear in mind about Amazons, before I go any further, is that they are a girl gang. The best kind of girl gang. They're described by a historian called Hellanikos of Lesbos as a golden-shielded, silver-axed, man-loving, boy-killing bunch of women. That is a girl gang I could really get on board with, to be honest with you. And so when he says boy killing, by the way, there isn't a record of Amazons killing boys, but he's trying to explain how they have a society of just women. And the only answer that he can come up with is they must kill, when they have boy children, they must kill them. But there is all kinds of enthusiasm amongst male Greek writers for Amazons being man-loving. I'll tell you that for nothing. Amazons are enormously popular in ancient times. It's genuinely a bit of a strange development, I think, that Amazons fall out of favour, because it's taken a really long time for warrior women to get back into our kind of mindset. But they're hugely popular in ancient times. The single most popular mythological figure painted on Greek vases which survive to us today and are identifiable is Heracles, to give him his Greek name. The most popular bit of his story that we see on vases is the labours, and the most popular of those is claiming the war belt of Hippolyta. The second most popular characters to be found named on vases from Greek myth are the Amazons. We have literally dozens and dozens of names of Amazons painted onto vases. Now, there are probably a bunch of reasons for this. The first is that these, often they're wine mixing bowls. When I say a vase or a pot, that's a bit of an unhelpful description, frankly. So often they are big bowls in which you mix wine and water. The Greeks drink their wine diluted, and then serve it from that at a party, a symposium, to give it its Greek name. And I think there's something probably fair to suggest that the kind of men who can afford to buy these very ornately decorated pots to show off to their friends are going to be having a slightly lower brow version of the conversation in Plato's Symposium. At Plato's Symposium, all the guests talk about the nature of love, but they get incredibly drunk, including Aristophanes, the comic playwright, who can't do his speech when he has to because he gets the hiccups because he's been drinking so much. You can always rely on a comedian, that's all I'm saying. And so we have to assume that most conversations were a bit less highbrow than in Plato. I think that's just a reasonable conclusion to draw. But there's this sense of lots of men being together, and you can kind of conclude that they would probably want to talk about and certainly look at images of women. And Amazons are deeply exciting to ancient Greek men, because here's the thing, they're not proper women, because they don't dress respectably. You know, Greek women wore, or Athenian women specifically, I guess, although we get vases from further afield in the Greek world, wore a tunic, a nice, smart tunic that's, might be belted at the waist, but it's not at all skimpy and it isn't revealing and all of those things. Amazons wear trousers. There could be nothing more shocking to a Greek man. Greek men don't wear trousers. Greek women don't wear trousers. Wearing trousers is something has gone terribly wrong when trousers are being worn. That's how the Greeks feel about this. This is an Eastern deviant behavior. And even more brilliantly, the Amazons are super close fitting. They wear these super close, like leggings, right? And they've often got these fantastically ornate geometric patterns on their leggings. There's some beautiful vases. I could only urge you to hunt them out if you have time after the talk. Not during, because that's just mean. You've turned up now. My feelings will be hurt if you disappear partway through. But these very beautiful, intricate, like zigzag patterns or diamond-shaped patterns or square patterns on their leggings. And you look at them and you think somebody would wear those now quite happily. They often have a tunic top, which similarly will often have these little square designs on it. But here they're not just ornamental, they are something called linothorax. I think that's the right word. So they're like armor, essentially. So what you would get is squares of leather, probably, or thickened chunks of fabric that are then stuck to the tunic so that you're a bit more armored for fighting. These are warrior women, make no mistake about it. But in vase paintings, they just end up looking like these incredibly beautiful, intricate geometric designs. And there's an incredible little alabastron, a little tiny perfume bottle. It's about this tall, in the British Museum in London, where I live. And she could be me. Do you know what I mean? She's got, her hair is tied back, but she's wearing these black, straight-legged leggings, and she's got this tunic on. And you think there are women streaming into that museum on a normal day who are dressed no differently from her, except slightly less armor. That's it. Other things you need to know about Amazons is they are not just warriors, but they are innovators at war. So Pliny the Elder, the one who dies, spoiler, when Vesuvius erupts, his nephew, Pliny the Younger, famously doesn't go and look closer at Vesuvius because he would rather stay at home reading Livy, which proves that history saves lives, at least one life. That's what I'm saying. And Pliny the Elder tells us that Amazons, or at least specifically Penthesilea, the Amazon warrior woman, invents the securus, the war axe, the fighting axe. So she's not just good at fighting, she's good at making sure she's got the best tools for fighting. And that, again, is a crucial thing to remember about Amazons. There are 3 great Amazonomiches, a word which I just don't understand why it doesn't catch on again, but a war with Amazons is the answer. The Greeks have a massive fight with the Amazons when Heracles/Hercules goes to try and claim the war belt of Hippolyta as one of his labors. They have another one when the Amazons invade Attica, the area around Athens, because Theseus has taken away or kidnapped or eloped with the Amazon Antiope, or sometimes she's called Hippolyta as well, confusingly. And then there is the 3rd great Amazonomiche, where the Greeks fight the Amazons at Troy as part of the Trojan War. And we'll come to that in a moment, but I thought before we would do that, we would talk a little bit about Hippolyta's war belt, because it is a source of, again, great annoyance to me that Hippolyta gets described in really feminized terms. And again, this is the sexism of the last 200 years. There's plenty of sexism in the ancient world, don't get me wrong, but this is our sexism. This is modern sexism. It's not their sexism, because in every single ancient author who writes about the war belt of Hippolyta, that's the word they use. The Greek word is zerster, meaning a war belt. Is the exact same word that's used of the war belt worn by Agamemnon, for example, the male hero in the Iliad, or Achilles, always the same word. So this is a big, fat, chunky belt that you can put weapons in order to make it easier to fight. And Hippolyta has been given hers by her father, the war god Ares. So she is really well equipped. I think Ares is the father of a bunch of Amazons. He's certainly the father of Penthesilea, for example. And almost always in translations, certainly 20th century translations are particularly egregious in this. It's described as the girdle of Hippolyta. Now, girdle is a really gendered term. You could just about argue Shakespeare uses the word in a genderless term, where Puck in Midsummer Night's Dream says he's going to put a girdle, meaning just a thin circle around the earth. But almost always it means something quite delicate, something worn by a woman. The Greek word for a woman's belt is a different word, zerner. That's never the word that is used to describe Hippolyta's war belt. So when it's translated as the girdle of Hippolyta, it kind of makes her sound weaker than she is. It is her badass war belt with, her cool fighting stuff in it. That's what it is. And, why else I mean, Heracles wants it because another young woman who's never met the Amazons has asked for it, and that is how it becomes one of his many, many labors. But, that there's a gendered issue, a slightly grimy subtextual sexual issue between Heracles going to ask a woman for something that she wears, reasonably around her waist. And Heracles is quite a dubious figure when it comes to sex at the best of times, frankly. If you want to die young, marrying either Heracles or Theseus is a really good bet. Just a recommendation for you there. Men, if you want to die young, be a colleague of Odysseus and try and get home from the Trojan War. I promise you, you will not make it. Number of Ithacans who get back to Ithaca during the poem The Odyssey. Just one Ithacan, and it's Odysseus. But yes, for women, being near Heracles, being near Theseus, very, very high risk strategy is all I'm saying. And so it bothers me, and it's always bothered me, that that these terms, in order to try and get across that notion of there being a sort of sexual subtext, this man is going to a woman and asking for this garment that she wears here below her waist. It's like, well, sure, but it's a war belt. It's a war belt. Stop turning her into something girly when she isn't. She's tough. She's a grown woman. It's not okay. Stop it right now. I demand it. But the Amazons always fight as a gang. They're a tribe. And this is really, really different from how, for example, men usually fight in the Homeric world. So in Homer, it's all a focus on individuals. There are individual duels. So we have Menelaus against Paris, for example, which is largely inconclusive, although Aphrodite intervenes to save Paris when it looks like it's going to go the other way. Or the duel between Hector and Ajax, or the duel between Hector and Achilles. It's very focused on an individual man fighting an individual man. We don't get much of a sense of them as an army. But when the Amazons arrive in Quintus Smoneus' Fall of Troy, which is a great deal less well known than Homer's Iliad, the Amazons arrive as a group, and they always fight as a group. If you look at visual representations, again, of the Amazons, what you'll see over and over again is examples of a bunch of these women, 5 or 6. I think Pausanias reports seeing a sculpture with 28 Greeks fighting 28 Amazons. He obviously stood there and counted them all to check that it's a nice balanced battle. But that's how it goes. The Amazons fight together. And that's what happens in Quintus Smoneus' Fall of Troy. So this is the story of Penthesilea, who has, in some versions of her story, in my view, the most beautiful version of her story, she is trying to compensate for having accidentally killed her sister. And so she turns up to fight at Troy, not particularly expecting to survive it, but trying to expiate this terrible crime. It's an interesting point that when, for example, Ajax commits a similarly terrible crime, he tries to kill his fellow Greeks after he doesn't get the armor of Achilles awarded to him after Achilles' death. It goes instead to Odysseus. And he's so outraged, he tries to kill them all. And Athene sends him mad, so he kills livestock, believing it to be the Greeks. And then when he comes to and his madness drops away from him, he's so ashamed by what he almost did that he takes his own life. So here's the thing. When this equally terrible accidental thing happens to Penthesilea, she doesn't do something as self-absorbed as take her own life. She goes and gives her life to a city which is not hers in order to defend it for a little longer. At this point, Hector, the great warrior of the Trojans, has already been killed. So this is towards the very end of the war. And, she gives her life to save a city which she has no connection to, no prior connection to. And it is the most extraordinary battle, as described by Quintus Smoneus. It's very, very brief. And this is, I should say, in no way a criticism of Penthesilea and her ability to fight. The duel between Hector and Achilles in the Iliad is extremely brief. And at no point do we think of Hector as being less of a hero because of that. Right? So Quintus Smoneus consistently uses language to make us think that she is like a goddess, or that she is, essentially as good as a man. In fact, that's the word that Homer uses, antianerai. He calls the Amazons, they're equal to men. They can fight against men. And Penthesilea comes out to fight with, I think, 12 women, and they cause quite a lot of carnage. They kill quite a lot of Greeks, but eventually when Penthesilea and Achilles fight, it's very brief, and only when he's killed her does he realize that she's a woman and not a man. Only at that point does he realize it. And he falls in love with her. In later versions of the story, he falls in love with her at this moment. Although, incredibly, in the Quintus Mennaeus version, a man named Thersites, who we meet in, I think it's book 2 of the Iliad, he criticizes the Greek leaders for their poor strategy in trying to overthrow Troy. Thersites sees Achilles emotionally stirred by what he's done by this dead woman, and he laughs at him. And Achilles simply punches him so hard that he drops down dead. It's like a cartoon. Just like, and then, I was like, I kickbox. It's quite hard punching somebody so hard they drop down dead. I should say I've never punched someone so hard they've dropped. I've sometimes punched someone so hard that, one of their hairs was slightly displaced very briefly. But I'm not as young as all the other people at kickboxing. Stop judging me, Sarah. I see what's happening here. So Penthesilea is then carried, and this, I cannot emphasize the importance of this enough. Penthesilea is carried from the battlefield by Achilles. You can see an incredible vase at the British Museum again, but it's on that online collection, of him carrying her body. It's like I think we would call it a fireman's lift. He's carrying her sort of over his shoulder to get her from the battlefield. And perhaps to us, this looks, a bit, what's the word I want? Disrespectful, that he's just sort of lugging her off the battlefield. But actually, it is the only example, as far as I know, anywhere in Greek literature or art, of a Greek warrior carrying his fallen enemy from the battlefield. There are plenty of examples of a Greek warrior carrying his comrades from a battlefield. But an enemy, it's just Penthesilea. Look what Achilles did when he killed Hector in book 22 of the Iliad. He ties him to the back of his chariot and he drags him around the city of Troy. He desecrates the corpse. He won't let anyone wash Hector's body. He won't let burial happen. He insists on him being left there to rot for 10 days while they have funeral games for Patroclus, the man that Achilles loves and Hector has killed. And it's only the intervention of, I think it's Aphrodite actually, that stops Hector's body from being despoiled by birds and dogs. She is the one who keeps him intact. And yet Achilles, this exact same man, although admittedly a different storyteller, Quintus rather than Homer, he carries Penthesilea from the battlefield. He's so regretful of what he's done. She is then buried outside Troy at the same place, in the same kind of mass grave, I guess, as Troy's greatest previous kings. So she's treated with the utmost respect. Agamemnon, Menelaus, none of these warriors disagree with this idea of just simply returning her body. All the way through the Iliad, we see examples of people being ransomed, their bodies being ransomed, sold back essentially to the other side because, the bodies aren't sacred. And yet here they are treating Penthesilea as something greater than themselves. It is a frankly extraordinary narrative, and one which I don't understand why it's not better known. It is a great story. It's a great story for a film. I can't tell you why it hasn't been turned into 100 films. It should have been. I probably should. Yes, I should talk to you about 2 women. Let's see if we've got time for 2 women. We'll see what we've got from the Trojan War story. But I'm going to talk to you about one who's in Troy and one who's not in Troy, or at least that's my goal. We'll see, because they are sisters, and that just seems sensible. The first is Helen. Helen of Troy, as we so routinely know her, who doesn't start out her life as Helen of Troy. Obviously, otherwise it would be a very brief war. She begins her life as Helen of Sparta. She's born in southern Greece, in the Peloponnese. And she is the daughter of Leda, who is the queen of Sparta, and Zeus, king of the gods, who famously impregnates Leda, having taken on the form of a swan. And even in the ancient world, this story is widely regarded as being curious. So in the Euripides play Helen opens the play by saying, yeah, so here's the thing. Zeus apparently impregnated Leda, having taken on the form of a swan, if you can believe that. And you're like, well, I don't know. It's your dad. Can you believe it? It's just fantastic. And then she goes, do you know what? It doesn't matter what you believe. I'm Helen. I was born from an egg. And you go, okay, fine. If you were born from an egg, fair enough. Let's have that. Yes. All right, fine. It always has struck me as one of the weird. How can it possibly be easier to seduce someone having taken on the form of a swan? Who goes, oh no, I'm not interested in you as a man-shaped king of the gods, but now you've got feathers, I'm here for this. No one has ever said that. Yes, sexy feathers isn't a phrase that anyone's ever used until today. And I already regret saying it. So there it is. Although it's been an enormously popular subject in art. You know, you can see paintings on the walls of frescoes, actually, in Pompeii. There was one found just a couple of years ago, of a really kind of peevish looking swan and leader. And he just looks really annoyed about that. It's like, dude, you're the one who's disguised as a swan. If anyone's going to be annoyed in this story, it's really her, I feel like, you know. And in the Euripides play, she says, oh yeah, he said he was being chased by birds of prey. So he changed it. It's like the king of the gods just changed into something that birds of prey don't eat. How a rhino, there you go. You're safe. The end. And that's how Helen ended up looking more like a rhino in my version. She doesn't, I swear. I wrote a very sensitive novel where nobody looked like a rhino, I absolutely promise. But every time I talk about it, it just becomes less likely to me. And, you know, I spend my whole life talking about Greek myths, so imagine how unlikely that makes it. So Zeus impregnates Leda. There's a nice Michelangelo one. Is it Michelangelo? I'm going to say it is Michelangelo, in which the swan does look quite racy. And you think, yeah, maybe if I was going to have to go for one swan, I would go with that one. That's quite a cute swan. But there are loads of Renaissance paintings where, you know, you get like a version of them where they're sort of in a Renaissance setting. So they're in like a bedroom that belongs to the time of the Renaissance rather than the time of Greek myth. And like a maidservant has just come in. And the leader is trying to sort of put a cushion in front of Zeus. So it's like, that's not convincing anyone. You've still got a swan in bed with you. Who are you trying to fool? Nobody's buying this. Stop it right now. Just don't have sex with swans. That's if you take nothing else away from today, I hope that you will at least take that. So although I should tell you that at the very beginning of the tour for 1,000 Ships, which is the novel I wrote about the Trojan War, I did a talk at Leeds University, I'm going to say, and a man came up to me afterwards and said, I really enjoyed your talk, but I do have an issue with you saying that nobody would be interested in a swan. And it's a really rare criticism for someone to come up with that. And he was very nice about it. He said, I used to be a fisherman. You go, dude, I'm not sure I want you to share everything that's about to happen. And he said, I had to rescue a swan. I'm like, the fact that the swan is defenseless is not improving this story as far as I'm concerned. He said, I had to rescue the swan and it stared at me with an adoring gaze. And I was like, okay, well, then I can see how, if you were feeling adored by a swan, that might... No, I can't. What am I saying? I can't see how. It's still a swan. It's still got feathers. It still has eggs. Stop seducing swans. That's nothing else. Just take that with you. So Helen is the daughter of Swan Zeus and Leda. And she grows up in Sparta and is famously the most beautiful woman that the world has ever known. And there are many, many men who come from across Greece in order to try to marry her. And it's Odysseus, in fact, who realizes that this is only going to be a source of conflict, that if she chooses any particular man, the others will feel, you know, that it's not fair and could invade that person's territory and all of those things. And he comes up with what is almost an excellent idea. This is a recurring theme in Odysseus's life, just FYI. He says, what we'll all do, he tells Helen's stepfather, Tyndareus, what we could all do is we'll all swear an oath that whoever Helen chooses, or you choose for Helen, depends on the version of the story. Sometimes she has more independence than others. He says, we'll all swear an oath, and then whoever she marries, if anyone takes her away, we all have to fight to defend that original husband. And it's a really good idea, because who is going to try and invade Sparta and take Helen away from Menelaus if all the weight of all the other Greeks is going to come down on them? Nobody at all. It's a really good idea. The only problem, of course, is that the man who takes Helen away isn't Greek. He's Trojan. Oh, so nearly a good idea. And that means all of the Greeks are then obliged to invade Troy, which, of course, famously takes them 10 years. And so we think of Helen as being the archetypal adulteress, right? Because she has this relationship with Paris. That means she leaves her husband and her daughter, Hermione, behind. And in some versions of the story, it takes them 10 years to get to Troy, and then they're in Troy for 10 years. So, you know, it's a really long time that she abandons her daughter for. It's the saddest bit of the story, really, I always think. And And certainly in Homer's version of Helen and Paris, they don't seem to be a particularly happy couple. They don't seem to get on particularly well in Iliad 3. Paris comes off the battlefield having had a not particularly impressive battle with Menelaus. And he's rescued by Aphrodite, and she sends him to Helen. And Helen says, "Oh, I don't really feel like, being nice to him now." Being nice to him is a euphemism, by the way. And Aphrodite says, "Well, too bad. You're my favorite, and you have to go and make him feel better about this, because otherwise, there'll be game over." And we realize that in this version of the story, Helen has very little autonomy at all. It's Aphrodite who has decided. Famously, of course, Aphrodite awards Helen to Paris as a consequence of the great beauty contest, as it's always described. So a golden apple on which the words Ter Callista, which mean for the most beautiful woman, are inscribed. This golden apple is thrown amongst the goddesses at the wedding of Thetis and Peleus. Thetis and Peleus will be the parents of Achilles. And the apple has been thrown by Eris. She is the goddess of discord, of strife. And it's debated between Athene and Hera and Aphrodite who should be the rightful owner of this apple. And Zeus, not wanting to get involved in this fight, quite sensibly suggests that somebody else does it. And it's Paris who he chooses, who is just a young man in Troy. And Paris is offered bribes by these three goddesses. Athene offers him success in war because she's clever. Hera offers him power because she is powerful, a kingdom of his own. And Aphrodite offers him the most beautiful woman in the world, which is Helen. And that's the option that he goes for. I should tell you that for the Greeks, and I think often for us as well, this decision makes Paris seem quite effeminate. It's a really interesting, well, we should think of him as one of the great lovers, but actually he doesn't seem very sexy in the Iliad. He's not a particularly good fighter, and they don't seem to have a particularly, exciting or sexy relationship. Although interestingly, we never get that sense with Menelaus either. They always seem incredibly mismatched as a couple, other than in the Euripides play Helen, where you think, oh yeah, no, maybe you can kind of vaguely see why she might have chosen him, just about, maybe. But Helen is not always Helen of Troy. In some versions of her story, including the Euripides play Helen, she doesn't go to Troy at all. She instead, and this dates back, I should tell you, to at least the 8th century. It is as old as Homer. It's as old as the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey. But in some versions of the story, she leaves with Paris, but she won't go to Troy with Paris. And she instead gets dropped off in Egypt. And she lives 10 completely blameless years in the palace of Proteus in Egypt, who is famously chaste, by which I mean not interested in women, or indeed men, rather than chaste, by which I would mean pursued by a bear or similar. And she lives these blameless 10 years in Egypt while the war rages. And the war rages because the gods create an eidolon, an image of Helen. It looks exactly like her, but it's just made out of air. And so the entire war happens in the exact same way that it happens when Helen goes to Troy, except she's not there. So she gets blamed for being the worst adulteress, and it's not even true. At the end of the war, the Greeks finally get their hands on the eidolon of Helen, and it just it disappears into the air that it's made of. If you're looking for a better metaphor for the futility of war, I honestly don't have one to hand. That one is pretty much spot on, I always think. And so there are multiple versions of Helen, some versions in which, as I say, she is at Troy, some versions where she is elsewhere, Egypt, for example. One of the weirdest versions of her is one of the oldest. It's the version of her that we find in Homer's Odyssey when Telemachus, who is Odysseus' son, goes looking for his dad. His dad has now been missing for 10 years after the war finished. So one of the places that he goes to is Sparta to see if Menelaus and Helen have heard anything about Odysseus and what he's doing. And he goes for dinner with them. He's welcomed in. It's one of my favorite things about this story is that the steward of Menelaus's palace goes into the palace and says, there's this young man outside who sort of claims to be, the son of Odysseus. And Menelaus goes, well, what are you doing leaving him outside? Bring him in. And you're like, dude, last time a young man came to your house, you literally lost your wife for 10 years. Maybe he's just a bit more cautious now. I don't know. And so Telemachus goes inside and they have dinner together. And he says, tell me about my dad. What do you remember about him? And Menelaus starts reminiscing about the comrades that he lost during the Trojan War. And he starts to cry. It all becomes too much for him. He's very emotional. And Helen does not say anything. She simply calls over a slave woman. And she asks for her to bring her this herb that she has from her friend Polydamna in Egypt. And this drug is called nepenthes by Homer. It's grief banishing, is what it means. And he tells us for 10 lines, he says, if you consume this drug, you won't, if you saw your parents die, you'd be fine. If you saw your child cut down with bronze, a spear, in other words, you wouldn't mind. It's like, oh, so it's a class A drug. I mean, this is serious business, is what we're talking about. And Helen just pours it into the wine and serves it up. And try as you might, it is the weirdest bit of the story. It's like people sometimes ask me at events, how do Helen and Menelaus get on after the war? And it's like, well, she drugs him every night, so he stops crying. I mean, she is absolutely brutal, is the answer. And yet she is, by the standards of Greek myth, the nice one in the family, because her sister is Clytemnestra. And these two sisters, Helen and Clytemnestra, marry two brothers, Menelaus in the case of Helen, and Agamemnon, who is the brother of Menelaus, and he is the commander of all of the Greeks when they fight at Troy. And he has one of the grislier ends after the war. So after the Trojan War has concluded and Troy has fallen, spoiler, then the Greeks have these things called nostoi, return journeys. The word nostalgia in English means grief. The algia is the same as a neuralgia or something like that. It means grief for your return journey, grief for your journey home, literally. And one of these nostoi is the Odyssey. One is Agamemnon returning to either Argos or Mycenae, depending on the version of the story, which is the part of Greece where he is king. And this is the story which is dramatized so brilliantly by Aeschylus in his Oresteia, and the three just extraordinary plays, the first of which, the Agamemnon, is one of the, I mean, they're all pretty good, huh? But it's one of the greatest plays really ever written in any language. And what's so interesting about it is that it begins with a watchman who is waiting on the roof of the palace, looking for a signal of fire, a beacon that will tell him that Troy has fallen. And we realize that Clytemnestra has been waiting for the city to fall this whole time. And we might start the play, if we didn't know the story already, thinking, well, she sounds like a really devoted wife because she's so keen to know when the war is over and her husband is coming home. But just in case you didn't know, the very next thing that happens is that the chorus of, they are the old men of Argos. So they were too old to leave 10 years ago and fight at Troy. So they're even older now. They've been waiting for their king and their, presumably their sons and nephews to come back from the war. And they sing their first choral ode, which is the story of Iphigenia. And Iphigenia is the daughter of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra. And the Greeks are waiting to sail to Troy 10 years earlier, so before the war begins, and they mass at a place called Aulis. And then somebody offends the goddess Artemis. Usually it's Agamemnon. Either way, the payback has to come from Agamemnon. And Calchas, who is the priest to these Greeks, tells him that what they need to do is sacrifice his daughter, Iphigenia, a human sacrifice, extremely shocking. And Agamemnon agrees to this. And they do something which is, I think, almost despicably unkind, which is to summon her, telling her that she's going to be married. It just kills me. Writing this version of her story in 1,000 Ships was just really painful because she's 15, 16, she's really young. And so she travels to Aulis with her mother, with Clytemnestra, thinking she's going to marry Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors. And it turns out that this whole thing is a setup, and actually she is to be the victim of human sacrifice. And the chorus reminds us of this at the beginning of the play Agamemnon, so we know that this is a really unresolved trauma, right? And that Clytemnestra is waiting for Agamemnon to come home, not because she's desperate to see him again, although she is, but because she is desperate to see him again in order to take revenge. And that, of course, is exactly what she does. There is the most extraordinary moment where Agamemnon appears on stage about halfway through the play, because the choruses are long in Aeschylus. And he addresses the chorus. He says, I'm back. Here I am being the king, blah, blah, blah. And she's right there, and he doesn't say anything to her. And she responds in the same way. She says, the king's back. She talks through him as well. And then she does something which is properly extraordinary in terms of stagecraft, quite aside from anything else. She has these beautiful tapestries. The wealth of the royal house of Mycenae/Argos is held in gold and silver and bronze, but also in this extraordinary fabric. And it's dyed with a dye called murex, which is made from like a squash. I think they're sea snails. And you have to squash a lot. I mean, I'm not saying you should. I remind you, vegetarian. You have to squash a lot of these sea snails to get enough purple dye. The Phoenicians are the ones who begin this incredible. It's what when the Roman emperors have purple togas, this is where the purple dye comes from, right? It's these squashed sea snails, and the dye alone, Clytemnestra tells us in this play, is worth its weight in silver. That's how valuable it is. It's the most valuable by weight item, I think, in the ancient world, pretty well. And then it's woven into these incredible, intricate tapestries. So they are very, very beautiful. And she tells her slave women to lay them on the ground so that Agamemnon will walk over them to get into the palace. And he says, no, I can't do that. That's the behavior of a god or a barbarian. Look at that. The luxury is problematic for him on 2 counts. 1, it's not suitable for mortals. And then 2, and if it is suitable for mortals, those foreign Eastern people, not people like proper Greeks like me, is what he says. But she wins. They have this battle of wills, and she wins. And so he takes off his boots and he walks into the palace over this incredible carpet of priceless tapestries. But here's the thing, as we watch this play, murex has a sort of dark, shimmering quality to it. So what we see is a man walking into his home over a river of blood, right? And then, of course, comes one of the great theatrical moments in Greek tragedy, in which Clytemnestra kills Agamemnon as he gets out of his bath. She uses a sword, I think, in this version. In many versions of the story, for example, the version in Homer, and this is picked up more by Roman authors later on, it's Aegisthus, Clytemnestra's illicit boyfriend. We haven't even got time to talk about the illicit boyfriend. He does the killing. And there's a fantastic pot by the Documentaria painter in Boston, in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, in which Aegisthus is killing Agamemnon with a sword, and Clytemnestra is sort of standing by with an axe, like, I'm here if you need me, with my axe. It was either this or pom-poms to cheer you on, but I went with axe. I just couldn't love it more. But the version in Aeschylus's play, I think, is more powerful, because this is a woman who has kratos, power. The chorus say, we come honoring your power, Clytemnestra. She is a political leader in this play, and she is determined to take revenge for the murder of her daughter. And she does kill Agamemnon, and she kills Cassandra, who is a priestess of Troy that Agamemnon has brought with him from Troy. He has obviously taken her as a slave. She is a war bride, is how I would perhaps describe it. But she has been enslaved because her city has fallen. And so their relationship is purely coercive. And he has failed to respect the fact that she is a priestess, and her body should therefore be sacrosanct to the god she serves, which is Apollo. Cassandra can see the future. She knows she's going to be murdered when she goes into the palace. And yet she goes because, she knows these things can't be avoided. That's what it means to see the future, but never to be believed. When she arrives in Argos, one of the most incredible images, she says she can see black furies dancing on the roof of the palace. These dark goddesses of vengeance are incredibly important when it comes to women's lives in particular, I think. So they are there because Iphigenia has been killed and revenge hasn't been taken. But they'll be there again after Agamemnon is killed because revenge hasn't been taken. That's what happens with this retributive justice. So Clytemnestra is this incredibly powerful woman, and just to prove it, at the end of the play, the chorus say, "Can't believe you could do that. You shouldn't, and it's terrible." And she says, "Why does his life matter to you more than Iphigenia's?" And they cannot answer her. And then she says, "I am absolutely not kidding. If you want power instead of me, fight me for it." And she doesn't mean metaphorically. She is offering them out for a fight. they are, I might tell you, wisely too meek to engage. It's literally all I have time for. I am so sorry. But please come back tomorrow for They Have Waited Long Enough, which will tell the story of Medea, which I didn't do today, Circe, who I also didn't do today, and Penelope, who is the cousin of Helen and Clytemnestra. So she comes from a very, very badly behaved family. What could possibly go wrong? In the meantime, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, James, for having me. I wish I could be with you in real, but it's been lovely to be here remotely. So I'll see you again when we can. Bye for now.